thank you for staying with the Monday Report. The conversation continues right now. Let me bring in Eric Deuri on this because this is more of a legal issue. One of the issues that the Azimio team is raising is audit of the IBC servers and stopping the assembling of the new IBC selection panel. Deuri, can a whistleblower report relitigate a case already decided by the highest court in the land, which is the Supreme Court?
Not really. I don't think so. I have had the opportunity to also just look at some of the allegations that have been raised in that so-called whistleblowers report. And really, I don't think that perhaps they raise to a threshold that should worry us so much as a country. And I think that there are certain times where you have to, for lack of a better word, move on. The questions about the integrity of the election system are things that we've had for a very long time. And I want to say that in this election, perhaps from the perspective of the Law Society, we were extremely keen about the usage of technology and how IBC employed the entire legal infrastructure to bring out elections that meet the constitutional threshold. And so far, from the reports that we have received from the so many election observers that we've had out there, we did not get any serious material infractions to make us believe that the election was not free and fair. But that said and done, I think that as a country, we also need to, one, develop institutions that then can be able to deliver on ensuring that we have a country that lives up to the very, very high standards and ideals we've set for ourselves in the Constitution. So I wouldn't want to talk so much, but I think that there might not be a very good and sound legal basis to call for an audit of the IBC system. But I think that as a country, we need to have a serious conversation about any reforms that we may need to the electoral process, to ensure that the results, that the gains that have been made, and there are quite significant gains that have been made towards electoral results, transmission, and transparency. But we always have to keep improving on that system, and if an audit is part of a continuous improvement process, then that is something that is welcome. But until such a time when you have really credible and sound basis to challenge the integrity of the results that were released the last time, I think we ought to support our institutions where they have given feedback, even if we disagree with it, and support the processes that have been undertaken.
All right. Irungu, what are your thoughts on this? Where should the focus really be? Because the Azimio team are placing certain demands. One of them is opening the server. The other one is auditing the IBC servers and stopping the assembling of the new IBC selection panel, all of which were done by the legal process that was there. You referred to the Constitution earlier on. So where should the country's focus be? Because they, as critics, are saying that a referee, players cannot pick a referee.
So, I mean, the issues of electoral justice and the stolen election from the narrative that Azimio has in terms of the last election will obviously resonate with 6 million of the voters that voted for Raila Odinga. But, you know, that's a very small number compared to the 28 million people, the 47% that are below the poverty line, or the 6 million people who are hungry tonight, or the 2 million children who are out of school, or the large percentage of young people who don't have jobs and can't see a future. That's where I think the politics of grievances will probably have their strongest resonation. Where they will resonate most strongly there. And I think for Kenya Kwanza, their challenge has to be. I think there's some live wires. The first live wire is corruption. If they fail, if they do not have a strong program around procurement-based fraud, conflict of interest, insider trading, and the appointment of people who have fallen short of Chapter 6, they are walking straight into the fire. The second one really relates to the issue of the promises that they made. I think if they are not able to meet those promises, as you know, and some of these promises takes much longer to do as a government than it does to say them as an election candidate. That's the second live wire. And then the third one, I think, is violence. I think if we continue to see, violence by the state, I remember reminding the Jubilee administration that however many police officers, there are only 100,000 police officers, you have so many tear gas canisters, you have so many rungus and batons. But the fact of the matter is you have 56 million people. You have to rule by consent. You have to rule by an inclusive enrollment of people rather than frightening people, because ultimately fear will turn to a very negative response from the people. So these are some of the challenges I think we would like the Kenya Kwanza to essentially work their way through, because we're in a season where it's a season of discontent. It's not going to be, the cost of living is not going to come down tomorrow. Yeah. The cost of unga will not come down tomorrow. So any whiff, any smell of living large, wastage, like the 50 cabinet administrative secretaries, will be treated with contempt by millions of people. Yeah.
And Nerima, what is the best way of achieving electoral justice? I know this is right down your alley, because it depends on where you're speaking from. It's really a game of perceptions. And so it says the legislators were involved in passing these amendments. The other side says that the players cannot pick their referee. How do you achieve electoral injustice in a country that is divided?
It's important to build consensus, because your last statement, you talk about division, and countries cannot prosper with division. Money follows stability, and so that's going to have to be the president's priority. So even when we talk about the IEBC, we're talking about our electoral management bodies, and Africa struggles with EMBs due to the fact that when we have representatives, people do not feel that we are represented enough. So it also builds this lack of transparency and lack of trust, which is the issue that we have with our elections. Now, when you look at the younger generation, they've decided that, by the way, I don't trust this institution, I don't trust this system, and we're seeing globally, young people are not participating democratically. So it's going to be an issue in terms of democracy and having the majority population engage. So I would say having the various stakeholders, pushing for independent institutions is key, and also building consensus is going to be important, because at the end of the day, Kenyan people want free, fair, and credible election. As long as the answer is free, fair, and credible, we're not going to have a lot of these disputes. People will be able to accept if they trust the system and they see it's transparent and accountable, and that is the beginning. But also to see that Kenya is a country that a lot of other countries look up to. A lot of the systems that we utilize were used in Nigeria. So even the challenges that we go through, other countries will go through them. So we're also a stepping stone to learning. And so even when we push, and we're so happy about the judiciary, we also see that these are underfunded. I worked with IBC under the Youth Coordinating Committee, and a lot of young people, once they learned about the processes, they wanted to engage. But a lot of times, that voter education was done very late with very little resources. So again, we can't just be doing voter education on election year. So I would say, That's one avenue, and also involving young people. A lot of these commissions, you'll hardly find a youth representative there. We talk about political parties a lot. However, they are vehicles that are constantly changing. Right now we have 89, and we're going to have almost 100, I'm sure, by 2027. And also when we talk about the cast positions as well, 50. But the previous administration, there were 23, and 7 of them were young people. And if you're even to follow the 7 who were within, there are maybe some 1 or 2, I would say they didn't do well, but the other 5 did very well. So there are young people who can also do a lot for this country, but they're often overlooked.
Okay. And Sheikh, when it comes to electoral justice, is it just a game of perception here? Because mostly they say the law was followed. In fact, right now, earlier on today, as the Azimio leader said that one of the demands is that the Cherera 4 have to be reinstated. Yes. 3 of them resigned. Irene Masit went through the tribunal. Yes. She was found unfit to be in office. So how do you achieve this when those who stick to the law say we are sticking to the law, and others say that the law is not good enough? It is still biased towards one side, that is the majority.
Trevor, if you look at the people who are saying maybe the law is biased, it depends on what side of the political divide they are. The problem we have in this country is that we politicize everything. Are there lessons to learn from the last election? Yes, many lessons. Actually, after every election, as Kenyans, we should sit down and do an audit. Where did we go wrong? Why should we wait until we get into another election year and then we commit the same mistakes with the same kind of results? What I believe myself as a religious leader is that no human system is perfect. We have to keep on improving, keep on learning. The problem with us is that we get very concerned about the electoral process during elections. After that, it's like business as usual, and then we do not learn from the mistakes that we've made. And I say, a wise person is one who is not bitten by a snake from the same hole twice. You walked through here, a snake bit you. Tomorrow again you walk through there. That is the problem. And again, when we politicize everything. You remember even when we were agitating for reforms in this country, once certain people came into power, actually it would be forgiven to think that these are the conformists. Once they sat there, they did not want any changes. And the people who are agitating for reforms now, once they sit there, they don't want any reforms. The people who are in power and then they found themselves on the other side, they start agitating for reforms. That is the problem. Double standards, and depending on which side of the divide you are. It is right when it favors you, and wrong when it does not favor you. I think our democracy is still not, we are not up to the mark up to now. That is the problem that we have in this country.
Okay. Deuri, let me bring you back on this. And another issue that the Azimio team is talking about is discrimination in state appointments. I'm looking at Article 254 of the Constitution. Appointments to commissions and independent offices shall take into account the national values mentioned in Article 10 and the principle that the composition of the commissions and the offices taken as a whole shall reflect the regional and ethnic diversity of the people of Kenya. Is this where the government has failed when it comes to state appointment? The reflection of the regional and ethnic diversity of the people of Kenya as per Article 250 of the Constitution?
Yes, the government has terribly failed in that aspect, and maybe the explanation is in the shares that the Deputy President spoke about, that those who did not invest in this company called Kenya are not going to get the share of it as the meat is being divided. It's extremely unfortunate that we have constitutional edits in terms of what the government must look like, and they are routinely ignored. They've become wishful thinking. And I think on this aspect, we have to lay the blame also quite squarely within the hands of the judiciary. Because when these complaints have been made, and the Law Society did challenge the composition of the list that was proposed for the permanent secretaries, and then the court just overlooked that, saying, giving a verdict that the petition was premature, while there were very gross violations. So, I mean, the court was almost saying that until those violations happen, there's nothing that it can do. And what are we looking at now? The government has become emboldened in its wanton disregard of very, very clear constitutional considerations. So this government is showing that the law is an inconvenience, and when the law is an inconvenience, it will be disregarded. And I think that speaks to what I think Sheikh was talking about, that when the latter day saints are now today's violators, and it happens depending on who is enjoying the trappings of power. So for those enjoying power, they forget about the songs of liberation that they were singing the previous day. And I think we need, as a country, to get to a level where we now develop institutions that are devoid of political interests, so that these games and rhetoric that we keep being treated every election cycle can come to an end.
Yeah. Irungu, I keep asking whether these demands are reasonable, because I'm trying to get to the solutions here. I mean, the Constitution addresses one thing, appointments have already been made. Now, when a demand is that this has to be done, if the literal aspect of it would then mean that you then have to fire everyone and re-employ. But that in itself will be extra legal, which the president himself said that he will only engage as per the law. But is this a misstep, especially on Article 250 of the Constitution?
No, I mean, I think, we've had historically, at some of the most intense periods of our history, political history, we had moments where there have been inter-party conversations. And ultimately, from what I hear of Azimio, is that they are very concerned that the composition of the IEBC and the framework for the next elections is being planned right now. And this is the concern. They have no faith, they have no trust that they will get a fair level ground as they go to the elections. That's what I hear behind the concern. How they fix it is possibly only up to them, in the sense that parliamentarians can come together from both sides of the divide and go into a discussion about what would give not just the two big party formations, but all the 89 party formations. I mean, and I think the other thing to mention, we've mentioned this a couple of times, is, the Electoral Commission is not actually a committee of party representatives. And this is the thing that I think has destroyed the last two elections, at least, if not many others. The Electoral Commission is a body that safeguards the interests of voters and ensures that voters do not have their votes suppressed by unfair advantage to one of the political competitors over the others. But I think an inter-party conversation would be the first starting point. And it should not just be Kenya Kwanza and Azimio, it should be a broad-based spectrum. I think the second process, and again, it will come back to dialogue. I think on the issue, we are facing yet another demonstration next week, right? So I think we have to also discuss what is going to happen between now and then, that the capital city, the center of about 27% of our GDP is not going to be treated to another shutdown. I think the Deputy President had a figure of about 2 billion shillings that may have been lost. If you just work on that 27.6% of the GDP and just take a very conservative figure, he can't be very far off. Right? So the question is, how are we going to deal with the grievances, the whole range of grievances before next Monday? And I think what we need to do is we need to see the National Police Service, an independent arm, sit down with the organizers of the demonstrations and have some very clear agreements on routes, on venues, and on how to deal with those elements that come to loot, not to picket or to demonstrate.
That's an interesting perspective you bring, Houghton, because that's where I was going. Because Article 131 talks about the president being a symbol of national unity, and many people are calling for a dialogue. Which form should the dialogue take? You have just mentioned that it's the protesters and the police who need to agree on where to do this. Isn't it supposed to be between the opposition and the government?
So
and who bears the greatest responsibility?
No, they're different levels. The responsibility for law and order and for protection of protesters under Article 37 does not lie with the executive. It actually lies with the National Police Service, primarily. And therefore, the National Police Service as an independent arm. And I think one of the things we have to stop seeing and listening for hearing is, cabinet ministers or even the president saying, I have instructed the Inspector General. If there is anything that will reduce the profile, the legitimacy, and the sense that this is an independent body, and let us be reminded that actually one of the concerns of Kenya Kwanza has always been the weaponization of the National Police Service under the Ruto Jubilee administration. So I think what we have to see is the National Police Service beginning to act independently of the executive. If it begins to take instructions from the executive, then it is lost, because nobody will see it as anything more than essentially an instrument of the administration. Yeah. So there are two levels, I think. You've raised another one, which is potentially a face-to-face meeting between the leader of the opposition, Raila Odinga, and the head of state, William Ruto. And I think there has been a lot of calls for this to happen. And I think, this would be healthy for the nation. Yeah. I think it would be in the spirit of accommodation for the president to initiate that rather than to have his opponent initiate it. I think he has the higher ground in terms of the state to be able to do that properly. Yeah,
Nerima, I'd like to hear your views on terms of what kind of format should this dialogue take? Because we were talking about the issues being raised, because already Azimia has laid out their issues. The president has said that he's only going to act within the law, nothing extra legal. Mm-hmm. So then which format should the dialogue take, if there should be one? Oh,
there should be one. And I find Irungu's perspective very interesting. I was even thinking about it. I was like, because I work in town. I work in Moi Avenue. And there are two kinds of people I avoid loyally, and it's the police and Kanjo. It's the police and Kanjo. And we're not the only ones. I'm going to work. I don't even know where I'm scared of them. But I've also been, stopped by a police officer to say hello. But I was scared because I knew I've done something wrong. So there's that barrier in terms of our relationship with the police, or the relationship with young people and the police, because we see a lot of police brutality, and a lot of the people involved in these protests are young people. So even just seeing the police is a trigger already, but also understanding that the laws around loitering that have existed since pre-colonial, we don't understand, or being arrested because you have dreadlocks and not understanding where that comes from. So I think that's a very interesting angle, and it's something that would change how even young people view police in terms of safeguarding our human right and protecting us. But I believe that the president should have dialogue with opposition. And on Friday, I had written a statement from the office, and I said that there's no time for the art of war. And I say this because a lot of us, when we read the book by Sun Tzu, we assume that it's strategy for war. But the very beginning of the book, or the most that he mentions, is if you can avoid war, avoid it at all costs, at all costs. And if war cannot be avoided, then this is the art of how to manage the war. So most of us skip that first advisement, and it would be avoid the war. So if the two can speak, it would be important, because I agree with Sheikh. There's a lot of chest thumping, and we're recognizing that the rest of us who is the grass when there are two bulls, tunakanyagwa. So we really need the bulls, to come, stop fighting and stepping on the grass, so that we can live peacefully and build a better country together. Yeah, but Sheikh, this dialogue, you have to come to the table with clean hands. How do you come to the table with demands? Because the government now is saying that they're being blackmailed.
Trevor, if I was the president of this country today, I would be very worried. Because at the end of the day, if things go wrong, he's the head of state. We have given him the instruments of power. Actually, he should be the one who is initiating all this. But again, even listening to all of us talking here, we would be forgiven to think that there are no other stakeholders in this country except the politicians. for God's sake, this country does not belong to the politicians only. And actually, if anything goes wrong, God forbid, these are the first people to jump in the next flight and go to other countries. It is the people that Nelima is talking about that are going to suffer the grass. So can we, when you talk about the dialogue, and I agree with Irungu, we need to sit down and talk with each other, not at each other. You know what is happening now? We are talking at each other. Listen to the deputy president, listen to the other side. We are talking at one another and also passing blame. So we need also to bring in other stakeholders, and especially those who do not have vested political interest. And let me be very selfish here. I think in the history of this country, religious leaders have always come to the rescue of the country at times like this. So I think we need to bring in other stakeholders, like the women of this country, the youth of this country, whose future actually is at stake. If you continue doing what we are doing now, bring in the religious leaders. And for me, I would suggest, and I'm telling the president of this country, and I'm telling the leadership, the religious leadership of this country does not belong only to the politicians.
Yeah.
The country sinks, all of us sink. It floats, we have to keep it floating. So the religious leaders, can they come up together and call the political leadership of this country and tell them the country does not belong to you, it belongs to all of us. Okay. So sit down and discuss things objectively. Okay. But the buck stops with the head of state.
All right. Yeah. Deuri, what are your thoughts on the dialogue issue before I come and give you all a chance for closing remarks?
I find it rather curious that we keep talking about this dialogue. I don't think that it has any place in the kind of system that we have. We have a presidential system of governance. I still think that we still have hangovers over the previous parliamentary system of governance that we used to have. And so therefore, dialogue, in my view, should be bipartisan political deal-making, bipartisan putting of the country at the top, and then so therefore making the best decisions for the good of the country. If you look at some of the challenges that we are having, they can adequately be addressed through law and policy, and so therefore this thing called dialogue in a structure that does not exist becomes extremely problematic. I say this because when you look at the challenges that we've had in the country, is that those who are in power tend to exercise that power in a manner that then excludes those who are not in power. And I think that is the genesis of the challenges that we are having. So for me, my belief would be that we really need to just have some sort of sanitization of the politics that we currently play in this country, that we put the country and the interest of the country above self and above political considerations. And when we do that, then these issues of dialogue, the feeling of exclusion, you can imagine when about probably 6 million people who supported a losing presidential candidate are feeling that they are excluded, when the communities are feeling that they are excluded because the Constitution gives very clear parameters in terms of how appointments should be done and the aspect of reflecting the true face of Kenya. And if government then is run in that manner, I don't think that this dialogue can achieve anything. What we need to go back is to have that sanitization of our politics, to be true to what the Constitution requires to all of us to be, and so the country will benefit a lot more from the feeling of inclusion, irrespective of which political divide someone supports. Right. But even if we have this dialogue right now, the dialogue will only benefit one or two people, but it would not bring about the feeling of proper inclusion in terms of even dealing with the challenges that we are facing as a country.
Okay, let me bring up some feedback real quick, and then I'll give you 30 seconds each for closing remarks as we wind up on this conversation. Time has flown by really fast. Let's bring up the feedback and see what you're saying. At Trevor Mbija, at Citizen TV Kenya, use the hashtag Monday Report. Online, this is what you're saying. Engineer Lazaro says demonstration over high cost of living was being observed in 4 African countries. Why only ours turned ugly? South Africa was more peaceful. They observed all constitution and rights to picket. Okay?
It wasn't. They were burning.
In South Africa, 4 people actually killed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yantika Chester says a society that has been pushed to the wall and is slowly becoming hopeless can be very daring and dangerous, and such dialogue be given a chance, and the teething problems, e.g. electoral injustice, high cost of living, insecurity, etc., be solved once and for all. Queen Kalala says the main problem we have with our leaders is ego. Everyone wants to look like a hero. On one side, Ruto wants Raila to surrender, and Raila wants Ruto to surrender. And now ego tells them not to table their issues. Okay. Okelo Molimu says today's protest could have served its purpose if the police were to act independently by not taking orders from above. It's the responsibility of the police to protect lives and property on such occasions. How many protesters were arrested for destroying property? Okay. Danson says before hitting the streets, Azimio should use the formal channels available to bring change. It is only when all that fails that they should invoke the power of the people to act directly to bring change. Babu Michael says the demos as seen today are not the best way to solve our issues when the top leadership of the country do not want to engage on healthy dialogue but chest thumping. The opposition sees demos to be the only solution. So which way, Kenya? Jesse says the president should lower the cost of living for such demos to stop. He promised a lot of things during campaign time, but right now, Kenyans are crying than ever before. No jobs, high cost of living, among others. All right, let's see if we can squeeze in one more. Moses says solutions cannot be found on barricading roads and mouse and rat runs and throwing stones in streets. The common Mwananchi is suffering the most in streets. The Azimio leaders should find an amicable way of airing their grievances, okay? And let's see what else you're saying. Samson says it is so painful that the current regime can afford to pay 50 CASs but can't address the high cost of living, among other issues. Okay? Tusive says the leaders should sit down and talk. Protests will interfere with our economy. Simple and straightforward, all right? Boji Andrew says coming down doesn't mean you are weaker. None of our leaders want to come down. Everyone feels superior. Kenya is not headed in the right direction. Irungu, closing remarks on this, 30 seconds.
So first, I guess we're reminded by one of the comments that today there was several protests taking place in very large, powerful and influential countries. In South Africa, let me just correct the argument that South Africa was less violent than Kenya, for example. We saw 4 deaths confirmed in the South African case. The protesters were essentially responded to by something like 3,500 armed army officers. I mean, they actually unleashed the equivalent of KDF on protesters in South Africa today. But the undercurrent is really much the same. It's poverty, it's inequality, it is youth unemployment at 35%. It is really the same kind of issues that we're struggling with here. And I think the leadership of Kenya Kwanza have to recognize a couple of things. One is that this is the season of discontent. They will have to be more skillful and more inclusive in the way that they engage with different levels of discontent. And one of them is the political class, but there is a large number, a social class that they ran an election on the back of that are still not seeing the dividends of their election. So I think that is the primary lesson for Kenya Kwanza, and hopefully we can see a shift before next Monday, because I think the concern is that we are going to get locked into these cycles of destruction, and really the country cannot afford it.
All right, Nerima?
Politics is very emotive, and people do have feelings, and the fact that they want to be heard and they want to see change is going to be very important for this administration. And also, when we talk about conflict, you will see a lot of the brunt falls on women and young people and children. And it's a plea that we do not get to that point. from both sides, just to find a solution for a peaceful country, for stability.
All right. Sheikh, I'll come to you last because you're the spiritual leader in this setup of ours. Let's go to Theuri first. Theuri, your closing remarks, 30 seconds.
Greedy for happiness, but our greed should not drive us to the brink of driving this country into social turmoil. I just want to remind the leadership that the true mark of a nation is not in how it treats its rich and mighty, but how they treat the vulnerable in society. So our greed for happiness should not outweigh the need to address unity of this country, the poverty that most of our young people are facing, and the challenges of creating a nationhood.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Sheikh, last word.
Very spiritually, I would want to tell the leadership of this country, ogopeni Mwenyezi Mungu, fear God. You stood up in front of God and man and so to protect the Constitution of Kenya and to serve the people of this Kenya without fear or favor. We want to remind them that the Lord is watching you. Please play your rightful, your part. Remember, you have a responsibility and you'll be answerable before God, maybe sooner than later. Again, when there is a problem, we need to look for solutions. And Waswahili wanasema usikate pua kuunga uso. When there is a problem with your face, you don't cut your nose. So when there is a problem, instead of creating more problems, look for solutions. And we can only get the right solutions if we put the interest of the country first. The problem is ego, just like one of the viewers said here. I think on both sides we have that ego. Let's think about the millions of people who went hungry today just because they did not go to the kiosk where they sell vegetables, just because they did not go to the industrial area where they get just enough to feed them for that day. Instead, we are thinking about people who, even if for a whole week they don't go to work, they not miss food. So I think what we lack in this country is people who have the fear of God, first of all, and two, who have the interest of the country at heart. They just think about themselves. Ogopeni Mwenyezi Mungu.
All right.
Santi.
Thank you so much for making time for us this evening. Sheikh Ibrahim Lethome from SUPKEM, Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya, Eric Theuri, President, LSK in Scotland, and Nerima Wako Ojiwa, Executive Director, Siasa Place. Thank you so much for making time this evening. My name is Trevor Ombija. It's always a pleasure having you with us here on the Monday Report. And whatever you do, be your brother's keeper. Good night and bye for now.